Mark Reynolds seemed to have it all. He was a successful accountant living in the quiet suburban town of Arlington, Virginia, with his beautiful wife, Sarah, and their bright 9-year-old daughter, Emily. On the outside, the Reynolds family embodied the American dream. Their white picket fence surrounded a modest, well-kept house. Neighbors would often see Mark playing catch with Emily in the front yard or walking hand in hand with Sarah as they strolled through the neighborhood on weekends. No one suspected the darkness that was about to unravel. But beneath the surface, Mark was struggling with demons no one saw. A few years back, after a back injury from a car accident, Mark had been prescribed opioid painkillers. What started as legitimate pain relief slowly morphed into a full-blown addiction. When his prescriptions ran out, Mark turned to the streets, where he could buy stronger drugs like heroin to keep the withdrawal symptoms at bay. His addiction spiraled out of control, consuming both his finances and his sanity. Sarah knew something was wrong. Mark was no longer the man she married. He became secretive, irritable, and distant. There were nights when he didn't come home, and when he did, he was either passed out on the couch or full of jittery energy, his eyes wild. Sarah tried to confront him, but he always deflected, promising that work had just been stressful. Emily, sensing the tension, spent more time in her room, her once cheerful demeanor clouded by worry. As Mark's addiction worsened, so did his paranoia. He began to believe that his wife was planning to leave him and take Emily with her. Every look Sarah gave him seemed to be laced with judgment. He convinced himself that they were better off without him, but his warped mind couldn't bear the thought of them living happy lives while he continued to sink deeper into despair. It was a rainy November evening when Mark reached his breaking point. He had spent the entire day holed up in the garage, snorting lines of heroin and brooding over the state of his life. His body ached from the drugs, his mind clouded with delusions of betrayal and abandonment. Every small noise from inside the house, Emily's laughter, Sarah's footsteps grated on his nerves. In his drug-addled mind, they had become the enemies, plotting against him, ready to leave him in the dust. That night, as Sarah cooked dinner, Mark lurked in the shadows of their kitchen, watching her every move. Sarah didn't notice the way he was staring at her, as she had long grown used to his mood swings and erratic behavior. Emily sat at the table, working on her homework, her innocent voice breaking the tension every so often with questions about math. The normalcy of the moment was deceiving. Mark's fists clenched as he imagined Sarah's life without him. His paranoia and delusions convinced him that she had already found someone else, someone who would replace him as a husband and father. The thought gnawed at him until he could no longer bear it. His heart pounded as he made his way to the drawer where they kept the kitchen knives. The moment came faster than Mark had anticipated. 1 second he was standing behind Sarah, his mind racing, and the next he was gripping the cold steel handle of a butcher knife. His vision blurred with anger and fear. Sarah turned around, her face softening into concern when she saw the crazed look in his eyes. "Mark, what's going on? You're scaring me." But before she could process what was happening, Mark's hand came down in a blind fury. The first stab was quick and savage, catching Sarah by surprise. Her scream pierced through the house, shattering the quiet evening. Emily dropped her pencil and froze, staring in horror as her father attacked her mother. Sarah's body crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around her as she gasped for air. Emily's voice broke the silence, crying out in terror, "Dad, stop, please." But Mark, lost in his drug-fueled haze, couldn't hear her. To him, they were already gone, already betraying him. Panic set in as Emily bolted from the kitchen, running toward the stairs, but Mark's rage followed her. Emily's small feet pounded against the hardwood floor as she raced toward the stairs, her mind whirling with fear and confusion. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest, the terror of seeing her mother bleeding out behind her making her legs move faster than they ever had before. She screamed for help, though deep down she knew no one would hear. The neighborhood was too quiet and her father's unpredictable moods had long since isolated the family from their once friendly neighbors. Mark's heavy footsteps followed close behind, the knife still in his hand, dripping with Sarah's blood. His breath came in sharp, angry bursts as he pursued his daughter. In his mind, Emily's cries weren't those of his frightened little girl. They were accusations, reminders of his failures as a father, of the life he had destroyed with his addiction. His vision was clouded by a haze of drugs and paranoia, making everything seem surreal. Emily's small body barely reached the top of the stairs when Mark grabbed her by the arm, jerking her backward with such force that she stumbled and hit the wall. The pain in her arm was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming terror of seeing her father, wild-eyed and unrecognizable, looming over her with the knife raised. "Daddy, no, please," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Her voice was hoarse from screaming, but it was as if he couldn't hear her, or worse, didn't care. In that split second, a small part of Mark, the part of him that was still her father, wavered. He hesitated, looking into Emily's tear-filled eyes, but the drugs coursing through his veins and the twisted, paranoid thoughts in his mind drowned out any sense of reason. His grip tightened on the knife as he lifted it, and Emily's sobs filled the hallway one last time before he plunged the blade into her chest. Emily's body went limp almost instantly, her eyes wide with disbelief as the life drained out of her. Stood over her, breathing heavily, the weight of what he'd just done pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint sound of rain tapping against the windows. Mark staggered back, dropping the knife as if it had burned him. His mind began to clear, but the clarity brought with it the horror of what he had done. He stared down at Emily's small, lifeless body, and the enormity of his actions hit him with full force. His hands, covered in the blood of his wife and daughter, shook uncontrollably. He collapsed onto the floor next to Emily, sobbing uncontrollably, his mind unable to reconcile the monster he had become. For hours, Mark remained there, numb, unable to move or think beyond the devastation he had wrought. He rocked back and forth, whispering to himself incoherently, his body convulsing as he came down from the drugs. In the back of his mind, he knew there was no going back. He had crossed a line, one from which there was no return. As the night wore on, the weight of reality became unbearable. He couldn't stay in the house with their bodies. The blood-stained walls and floors were a grim reminder of the life he had destroyed. He stood up slowly, his legs weak and unsteady, and stumbled toward the door. He needed to leave to get away from what he had done. But as he reached for his car keys, the crushing weight of guilt threatened to consume him. His thoughts raced. Could he run? Could he disappear and pretend this had never happened? Mark climbed into his car, his hands trembling as he started the engine. The rain had picked up, the windshield wipers moving frantically to keep up with the downpour. His mind was racing in a million directions, and he had no plan. All he knew was that he had to leave the house before the walls caved in on him. But as he drove aimlessly through the empty streets of Arlington, his thoughts turned darker. The faces of Sarah and Emily haunted him, their accusing eyes flashing in his mind every time he blinked. There was no escaping this. The drugs, the rage, the blood, they had all taken too much from him, but he had taken everything from them. As the rain battered the windshield, Mark realized the awful truth. He couldn't live with himself, not after what he had done. The pain, the guilt, the crushing weight of his actions, they would never leave him. Mark drove through the deserted streets, the city's neon lights blurred by the rain as his thoughts spiraled out of control. So windshield wipers clicked rhythmically, but the sound did nothing to soothe the chaos in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes for even a second, he saw their faces, Sarah's wide, terrified eyes, Emily's pleading cry for mercy. His heart raced, his breathing quickened, and the weight of his guilt felt suffocating. The drugs had started to wear off, and now, for the first time that night, he felt the full gravity of his actions. He had killed his family, the two people he loved. The world was in the world. There was no undoing it. No amount of regret, sorrow, or shame could bring them back. He turned onto an empty highway, the city lights fading into the distance behind him. As he drove, Mark began to think about how it all end. He could run, hide, and disappear, but what kind of life would that be? Fugitive, haunted by memories he could never escape. Every moment from now on would be a waking nightmare. And when the drugs wore off, there would be nothing left but pain. Then, in the back of his mind, a single thought began to take shape. He didn't deserve to live. So not after what he had done. He didn't deserve to breathe another breath in a world where Sarah and Emily no longer existed. So guilt gnawed at him, whispering that the only way to make it right was to end it here and now. Mark glanced at the speedometer. He pressed his foot harder on the gas pedal. The car speeding down the slick, rain-soaked road. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His vision blurred with tears as the thought of his family, his broken, shattered family, overwhelmed him. He saw a curve in the road ahead, but instead of turning the wheel, he pushed the gas pedal even harder. The car veered off the road, smashing through the metal guardrail and plunging down the steep embankment. For a brief moment, everything seemed to float in slow motion. The rain, the sound of crunching metal, the cold air rushing into the cabin. Then came the impact. The car crashed into the trees below with a sickening thud, flipping over several times before coming to a stop, twisted and broken in the dense woods. So next morning, Arlington woke up to the sound of police sirens and the rumble of ambulances rushing toward the Reynolds residence. A neighbor, concerned after hearing screams the night before and seeing no sign of family all morning, had called 911. When officers arrived at the scene, the front door was slightly ajar, a haunting stillness inside the house. The officers entered cautiously, their flashlights illuminating the darkened interior. The smell of blood was thick in the air, mingling with the coppery scent of death. In the kitchen, they found Sarah's body lying in a pool of her own blood, her once vibrant face pale and lifeless. It didn't take long to find Emily, her small body crumpled at the top of the stairs, a sight that left even the most seasoned officer shaken. Detectives quickly pieced together what had happened, though the full horror of the crime was unimaginable. Blood splattered across the walls told a story of violence, rage, and madness. It was clear that whoever had committed these brutal murders was in a drug-fueled frenzy. So the absence of Mark left one glaring question: where was the husband and father who had once been part of this seemingly perfect family? Within hours, a statewide alert went out and police began to track Mark's whereabouts. His car was missing, and it didn't take long to locate the path he had taken after fleeing the house. By mid-afternoon, an officer radioed in from the outskirts of town. They had found Mark's car, a mangled wreck at the bottom of a steep ravine. The crash site was chaotic. The car was barely recognizable, crumpled into a heap of twisted metal and shattered glass. It had collided with several trees on its way down, finally coming to rest against a large oak. EMTs worked quickly, expecting to find Mark dead inside the vehicle. But when they pried the door open, they were surprised to find him alive, though barely conscious. His body was broken and blood poured from multiple wounds, but somehow he had survived the crash. Mark was rushed to the hospital, where doctors fought to keep him alive. His injuries were severe, multiple broken bones, internal bleeding, and a concussion that left him drifting in and out of consciousness. But as he lay in the hospital bed, sedated and under police guard, the weight of his crimes hovered over him like a storm cloud. The police had already declared him the prime suspect in the murders of Sarah and Emily. It was only a matter of time before Mark Reynolds would be held accountable for the destruction he had caused. News of the double murder and Mark's attempted escape spread quickly through the town. Reporters swarmed the Reynolds home, capturing the gruesome scene that had once been a place of suburban tranquility. Neighbors were stunned, struggling to reconcile the image of the friendly, quiet man they knew with the horror that had unfolded in his home. Mark awoke in a hospital room, his body hooked to machines, the beeping of monitors the only sound in the sterile room. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or why he was there, but then it all came flooding back: the knife, Sarah's terrified face, Emily's desperate cries for help. The weight of it was suffocating. He wished he hadn't survived the crash. The uniformed police officer stood by the door, his eyes trained on Mark. There was no escape now. The moment he regained consciousness, he became a prisoner. The hospital staff informed him that once he was stable enough, he would be transferred to a jail ward until his trial. Mark was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He would likely spend the rest of his life in prison, but prison seemed like too light to punishment for what he had done. As the days passed, Mark barely spoke. The drugs they administered to control his pain kept him in a fog, but it wasn't enough to silence the haunting images of Sarah and Emily's lifeless bodies. Detectives visited his room, asking for a statement. They wanted to know why he did it, what had driven him to such a horrific act. Mark remained silent, his face a mask of exhaustion and regret. He didn't know how to explain what had happened. How could he? How could he explain the gradual erosion of his mind, the way the drugs had twisted his thoughts, or the paranoid fantasies that had convinced him his family was against him? None of it made sense to him anymore. All he knew was that he had destroyed everything that mattered. Meanwhile, the media circled the case like vultures, the story of a seemingly perfect suburban family torn apart by drugs and violence captivated the public. Headlines splashed across newspapers and TV screens: "Father murders family in drug-fueled rampage," and "The Reynolds family behind closed doors." Neighbors were interviewed, expressing their shock and disbelief, struggling to understand how the quiet man next door had turned into a murderer. Mark's surviving family, his parents, siblings, and cousins, were left reeling from the news. They had known about his struggles with addiction, but never imagined it would lead to such a tragedy. As they prepared for the funerals of Sarah and Emily, they wrestled with their grief and the horror of knowing their own son had committed such a heinous crime. 6 months later, Mark was wheeled into court for the beginning of his trial. The media presence outside the courthouse was overwhelming, with reporters snapping photos and shouting questions as Mark, now gaunt and pale, was escorted inside in shackles. His defense team had little hope of winning the case. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah and Emily's blood was on his clothes, his fingerprints were on the knife, and the timeline of events was clear. The prosecution would argue that Mark had planned the murders, driven by paranoia and his spiraling drug addiction. They would paint him as a cold-blooded killer who had turned his back on his family. Mark's lawyer, a public defender with little experience in high-profile cases, attempted to present a diminished capacity defense. He argued that the years of drug abuse had altered Mark's mental state, that he wasn't in control of his actions the night of the murders. The defense team brought in psychologists who testified that Mark had been suffering from severe opioid-induced psychosis, making him incapable of fully understanding what he was doing. But the jury wasn't swayed. The prosecution was relentless, presenting the brutal details of the crime with chilling clarity. They showed photos of the crime scene: Sarah's lifeless body in the kitchen, Emily's small frame at the top of the stairs. They played 911 calls from concerned neighbors who had heard the screams but hadn't realized the horror unfolding next door. They made it clear that no amount of drug addiction could excuse what Mark had done. The trial was a painful spectacle for everyone involved. Sarah's parents, sitting in the front row, wept as the details of their daughter and granddaughter's final moments were laid bare in court. For Mark's family sat quietly consumed with shame and grief, barely able to look at him. Every day of the trial felt like a fresh wound being opened, exposing the raw agony of the lives destroyed by Mark's actions. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned with a guilty verdict on all charges, 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, a stern-faced man who had presided over the case with grim detachment, sentenced Mark to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no outburst, no plea for leniency from Mark. He simply stared at the floor, accepting his fate. Mark was transferred to a maximum security prison where he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The cell was small, the walls cold and gray, offering no respite from the torment in his mind. She had nothing now but time to think about what he had done, time to relive the horror of that night over and over again. Cellmate, a man serving a life sentence for armed robbery, left him alone, sensing that Mark was a man teetering on the edge of his sanity. The other inmates gave him a wide berth as well. News of his crime had spread quickly through the prison system, and even among hardened criminals, a man who had murdered his wife and child was considered the lowest of the low. Mark rarely spoke, preferring the solitude of his cell over the hostility of the prison yard. So he spent his days in silence, staring at the walls or lying on his thin mattress, replaying the events of that fateful night in his mind. The prison psychologist tried to engage him in therapy, offering sessions to help him come to terms with his actions, but Mark refused. He didn't want to talk about it. There was nothing to say that could make it right. Years passed, but for Mark Reynolds, time stood still. Every day in prison bled into the next, a monotonous cycle of isolation and regret. He no longer counted the days, the weeks, or even the years. There was no point. His sentence was life without parole, and he had accepted that he would die behind these concrete walls. Mark had become a ghost within the prison, a man consumed by his own guilt. He avoided contact with other inmates, drifting through his routine like a shadow. The prison staff had long since given up trying to get through to him. His silence was all-encompassing, a self-imposed penance for the unforgivable acts he had committed. In the rare moments when he allowed himself to think of Sarah and Emily, the pain was unbearable. He had taken their lives in a haze of drugs and madness, but the clarity of his guilt was now all too real. Once Mark had been a man with a family, a father, a husband, but now he was defined solely by the brutal crime he had committed. The opioid addiction that had led him down this dark path had faded, replaced by a deep, unshakable sorrow. So in the quiet hours of the night, when the prison was still, Mark would sometimes whisper their names, as if calling out to them might bring them back, but there was only silence. Despite the prison psychologist's efforts, Mark refused any attempts at rehabilitation or redemption. He knew in his heart that there was no redemption for what he had done. Some nights he would wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of Emily's last scream echoing in his image of Sarah's image lines vivid in his mind. These nightmares were his constant companions, inescapable reminders of the irreversible destruction he had caused. The years dragged on, and Mark's body began to break down, much like his spirit. He suffered from chronic pain, the result of the car crash and the harsh conditions of prison life. So eventually, illness took hold of him. His body, already weakened by years of addiction and abuse, began to fail. Doctors diagnosed him with liver disease, but Mark declined treatment. He was ready to die, though death came slowly, prolonging his suffering. In his final days, Mark lay in the prison infirmary, frail and gaunt, barely recognizable as the man he had once been. The other inmates continued to ignore him, and the guards simply did their job, showing little sympathy for a man who had become infamous for his crimes. Alone in the sterile, cold room, Mark faced the end with quiet acceptance. There were no visitors, no goodbyes. His family had cut ties long ago, unable to bear the weight of what he had done. As his body shut down, Mark's last thoughts were of Sarah and Emily. He wished he could go back, erase that terrible night, and undo the damage he had caused. But there was no going back, only the empty, heavy silence that would soon consume him entirely. So Mark Reynolds died quietly one early morning, his heart finally giving out after years of torment. His death went largely unnoticed, except for a brief note in the prison records. There were no headlines, no memorials, no one to mourn him. He left behind nothing but the haunting memory of a family torn apart by his actions. In the end, Mark Reynolds became a cautionary tale, a man whose life unraveled under the weight of addiction, paranoia, and violence, leading him to commit the unthinkable. His story faded into the annals of true crime, a grim reminder of how far a person can fall when darkness takes hold. For Mark, there had been no redemption, only the silence of a life forever marked by tragedy and loss.